My mother's fiancé was Richard, a really important person in the circles of the rich. They had met when they didn't have anything, going through a lot of tough times together. But just when they were about to finally get married, my mother and I were sold off to another country. To keep me safe, she was blinded and her spine was broken. By the time she died, there wasn't a single spot on her body that wasn't hurt. When Richard finally found us, he was just in time to save me, but I was terrified and shaking. I gave him one of my mother's fingers that had been cut off. On it, covered in blood, was the engagement ring he had put on her hand himself. I watched as he ripped off the Buddhist prayer beads he always wore on his wrist. Right then, he became filled with darkness, completely focused on getting revenge. When those people came after us, my mother used all the strength she had left to hide me in a garbage pile that smelled awful. The last thing she ever said to me was, "Ethan, stay hidden. Don't make a sound. No matter what happens, don't come out. Wait for your father to save you." After she said that, she reached out blindly and held me, cupping my face as she kissed my forehead really hard, like she was desperate. Her eyes were just two empty, bleeding holes. Every bone in her body had been broken. She couldn't pick me up and run anymore. I did what she told me, covering my mouth tightly, not even daring to make a tiny sound. Her screams echoed in my ears, each one sounding more painful than the last. I was shaking all over, and tears were streaming down my face, but I didn't let out a single sob. In the end, her voice gave out, and the hitting finally stopped. Through the small gaps in my hiding place, I saw her body, all bloody and messed up, still trying to move across the ground. Her broken fingers were reaching out desperately, searching for something. Finally, it looked like she found what she was looking for. With the last bit of strength she had, she slipped the ring back onto her finger that had been cut off. The next moment, I watched as those people walked towards her again, holding knives. One by one, they cut off her fingers. They laughed, a mean, inhuman laugh. I didn't cry. I just opened my eyes wider, burning their faces into my memory, one by one. I didn't listen to my mother. After those people set her body on fire and left, I crawled out from the garbage pile. Just before the sun came up, I found the only piece of her that was left, one finger that had been cut off. On it was a ring, covered in blood. I knew that ring. Every time my mother showed it to me, she would smile so sweetly. She used to say, "This was the first thing your father bought for me with the money he worked so hard for. It was cheap, but it's my most precious treasure." Later, my father became rich, so rich that he could buy her all kinds of jewelry and expensive stones, but the only ring she ever wore was that simple silver band. Even when she was dying, with her last breath, she had been desperately trying to find it. So, I had to give this ring to my father. I pressed my mother's finger against my chest, hiding it close to my heart, then crawled back into the garbage pile. When Richard finally dug me out, I was covered in dirt and smelled like something rotting. My face was so dirty you couldn't even tell who I was. But his eyes, all red from not sleeping, locked onto me, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me so tight I could barely breathe. "Ethan," he said, his voice shaking as he called my name. "Daddy is taking you home." I didn't cry. I just reached into my pocket, took out my mother's finger, and handed it to him. "Mom was burned up. This is all that's left of her," I said. My eyes were wide, and tears were starting to well up, but I bit down hard, not letting them fall. Richard clenched his jaw so tightly that his cheekbones stuck out, and I could see his temples throbbing as he tried not to show his emotions. But in the end, as he touched that finger, as his fingers traced the blood-stained ring that had lost its shine, big, heavy tears fell onto my face. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice rough and broken, we're bringing Mom home." Carefully, he tucked my mother's finger against his chest, holding it like it was the most sacred thing in the world. Then, he picked me up in his arms. But as he tried to stand, his knees gave out and he fell to the ground. I heard his voice, raw and shattered, crying out my mother's name. With one strong pull, the prayer beads around his wrist snapped apart, scattering everywhere. "Lily," he whispered my mother's name one more time. And when he finally stood up again, I saw his blood-red eyes. Right then, I knew he had become like a demon. After we got back home, Richard never let me out of his sight. I had seen my mother being beaten to death with my own eyes. I was so scared I stopped talking completely. Richard built a memorial for her. But after the burial, he never went back to visit it. The finger that had been cut off, though, he kept it safe, always carrying it close to him. Even after my mother's death, women still wanted to become Richard's wife. My grandfather on my mother's side sent my aunt, who was my mother's half-sister. The moment she saw me, she started crying and held me so tightly she wouldn't let go. She cried, "Poor Ethan, so young and already without a mother. What will he do now?" My grandfather added, "A real aunt is better than some stranger coming in and treating Ethan badly." My aunt held me a little tighter, then looked at Richard quickly. You could easily see how much she admired him. She said, "Brother-in-law, I just feel sorry for Ethan, and for my sister. I only want to take care of him in her place." I turned to look at Richard, too. He was sitting on the sofa, his face cold and like he didn't care, as if nothing in the world could make him feel anything. His fingers were just playing with the new prayer beads on his wrist. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he nodded. "Then stay and take care of Ethan." When my mother's best friend Isabel found out that Richard had let my aunt stay, she rushed into the house, really angry. She accused him of not having any feelings. "Lily's body isn't even cold yet, and you're already bringing in someone new," she said. "Even if she's Ethan's aunt, Lily didn't talk to them much when she was alive. How sincere could she possibly be? I don't trust her. If you insist on marrying someone else, then I'll take Ethan with me." Richard stood behind his desk, tall and calm. The loose sleeves of his clean shirt showed his thin wrist with the prayer beads. His fingers played with the beads as he looked up at Isabel. The light from the window came in at an angle, making shadows on his sharp features. For a moment, Isabel seemed lost for words, her breath catching as she stared at him. Richard spoke, his voice calm and steady. "If you're really worried about Ethan, then why not stay and take care of him yourself?" Isabel stammered, her words getting stuck in her throat. But her face turned bright red. The anger she had felt just a moment ago seemed to disappear right away. She mumbled, Then I'll stay for a few days, at least until Ethan settles in." And so, Isabel stayed too. That night, I heard the servants whispering. My aunt was really angry, so angry that she locked herself in her room and spent the whole night breaking things. I didn't like my aunt. When my mother was struggling to get by, my grandfather's family never even paid attention to us. It was only after my father was accepted back into the Wang family that they shamelessly started showing up at our door. My mother was kind and gentle, but I was more like Richard, cold and not caring. After all, even though I was young, I remembered everything clearly. I remembered my grandfather calling me useless just because I started talking later than other kids. I remembered my aunt saying with a sneer that I looked just like my father and would grow up to be just as heartless as him. None of them were good people. I didn't really like Isabel either, even though she had been one of my mother's closest friends. When my father was poor, she had told my mother to break up with him, saying he wasn't good enough for her. Yet secretly, she would bring him chicken soup and give him money without my mother knowing. Later, when my father returned to the Wang family, She would whisper worries to my mother, warning her that now that he was rich, he would definitely leave her and never marry her. My mother had believed it. She cried in secret, over and over again. Once she even packed our bags silently and took me away. My father had searched for us everywhere, staying awake for days and nights until he finally found us. When he did, he held my mother so tightly he wouldn't let go. After that, their marriage was certain. Because he was determined to marry my mother, my father had knelt for 3 days and 3 nights, even passing out a few times. Only then did the strict, traditional, older members of the Wang family finally give their reluctant approval. But the one I liked the most was my mother's other best friend, Chloe, the kindest and most gentle lady in the wealthy circles. She had been my mother's roommate in college. She had never once looked down on my mother for being poor. When my mother gave birth to me, my parents barely had any money and could only afford a cheap hospital. It was Aunt Chloe who paid to move my mother to the best hospital available. She even paid for the most expensive care after she gave birth. And now, my mother was gone. All the women around were trying to become my stepmother. Only Aunt Chloe. When she heard the news, she fainted from sadness and was still in the hospital. Richard took me to visit her. When I saw her, I was shocked. She looked so thin and weak, her eyes red and swollen from crying so much. The moment she saw me, tears poured down her face as she held me tightly, not wanting to let go. Richard sat beside us, watching as Chloe and I held each other and cried. His own eyes started to get watery. When we had cried enough, Chloe gently told me to go wash my face and eat some snacks. Then she turned to Richard and asked, "Have you found everyone who was involved in hurting Lily?" Richard replied, "The ones who did it have been taken care of, but the person who planned it is still unknown." Chloe was quiet for a moment before saying, "Lily disappeared after Clara Shu invited her out for lunch and shopping." "Richard, Clara Shu was once the woman your father wanted you to marry. Do you think—" Richard's face turned ice cold. "There's no proof yet." Chloe's voice remained soft, but her words were serious. "The Shu family has businesses all across Southeast Asia, in both the legal and the criminal world." Richard fingered his prayer beads, letting out a slow, bitter chuckle. "Yes, the Shu family is powerful." Chloe bit her lip before suggesting, "Richard, why not join forces with my family, the Kim family?" As she spoke, fresh tears welled up in her eyes. She continued, "If our families work together, your power will grow stronger, and you'll be able to get revenge for Lily sooner. Once you've gotten revenge, we can get divorced. My only wish will have been fulfilled." Her words showed so much loyalty, spoken with complete honesty. Even as I stood outside the door, I was really touched. And when I looked at Richard, I saw that he, too, was unsure. He murmured, "But Chloe, this would be too unfair to you." Chloe replied softly, "I have known Lily for almost 10 years. We weren't related by blood, but we were closer than family. The way she died, so horribly." Her voice broke, and she couldn't continue. She looked at Richard and said, "If I can't do something for her, I will never have peace for the rest of my life." Looking at those clear, honest eyes, filled with pure kindness, it seemed impossible for anyone to refuse her. I, too, thought he would agree. After all, he had only just returned to the Wang family. His position wasn't secure. Even though he had a lot of money, he didn't have power or influence. If he married Chloe, the beloved daughter of the important Kim family, everything would change overnight. His standing within the Wang family would become strong and certain. But Richard refused. He stood up. From where I was behind the door, I could only see his thin back. I couldn't see his face. Chloe's cheeks turned a light shade of red. Richard's voice was calm, distant. "This is not needed, and unfair to you, to say the least. If I were to marry someone else, even after death, I wouldn't be able to face Lily again." "Richard!" Chloe was shocked. She hadn't expected him to say that. Richard raised a hand, stopping her from speaking further. "I understand that you're doing this for Lily, and I appreciate it." Chloe lowered her eyes, tears falling silently down her face. Richard told her to rest well, then turned and walked out. As he stepped outside, he casually picked me up in his arms. He carried me all the way home, back to the small house where the three of us had lived for 5 years. He cooked me lunch, 1 dish of meat, 1 of vegetables, and a bowl of soup. After eating, we rested on the lounge chair on the balcony, just like we had in the past, when my mother was still alive. "Ethan," he said, stroking my hair, his eyes gentle and warm. I lay in his arms. I don't know how much time had passed when I suddenly felt a wet spot on my back. I tried to lift my head to look at him, but his large hand pressed firmly against the back of my head, keeping me close. I knew. He was crying again. After barely 3 days of living together peacefully, my aunt and Isabel finally couldn't hold back. They got into a heated argument that quickly turned into a physical fight. By the end of it, my aunt had lost some of her hair, and Isabel's face was scratched. I was so scared that I hid in a cupboard and wouldn't come out. Richard was really angry. Both my aunt and Isabel were kicked out. After all, they were supposed to be taking care of me, but they had only made things worse. Even my grandfather didn't dare say anything against it. Isabel, knowing she was wrong, stayed quiet for a while. 3 months after my mother's death, the older members of the Wang family started pressuring Richard to remarry and have children. They said, "Getting married isn't just about you. It's for your older brother and for the entire Wang family. The more children, the better. You should have at least 3 sons, and Ethan must be adopted into your brother's family line. Your poor older brother, his health is weak, and he refuses to marry because he doesn't want to ruin some young girl's future. But as elders, we cannot allow our family line to end. The Shu family has been kind enough to overlook your past and Ethan's existence. They're still willing to have Clara marry you. Pick a date and make the engagement official." Back then, Richard had knelt for 3 days and 3 nights just to marry my mother. The Wang family had an older son who was often sick. They had worried that this younger son who had been lost for so long might also be weak or sickly. So they had reluctantly agreed to the marriage. But now that my mother was dead, Clara wasn't willing to give up. She wanted to marry into the Wang family and become my stepmother. A faint memory stirred in my mind. Clara had always been a spoiled little princess. She had met my mother through Chloe, acting like she wanted to be her friend. My mother had a kind heart and was easily fooled. She didn't realize people might have bad intentions and gradually became close to Clara, going out with her often. One night, Clara finally lost patience and showed her true colors. At first, she had tried to convince my mother to leave Richard willingly, but when my mother refused, she became mean. "Lily, don't be stupid. Don't make me use other ways. I'm warning you. Nobodies like you are easily gotten rid of. I could crush 10 of you with 1 slap. If you don't break up with Richard, I'll have you sold overseas. I'm telling you now. The people who traffic people over there are cruel. They won't just kill you. They'll take everything from you, even your organs." I vaguely remembered Clara's face that night, her angry, arrogant look. But my mother, she hadn't been scared at all. She had just smiled, foolishly, gently, as if she hadn't heard a single threat. For some reason, I had always thought Clara was just another silly, spoiled rich girl. She acted tough, but deep down she seemed weak. I remembered one time when my mother took me out to play. A disgusting bug had flown in from somewhere and landed on Clara's expensive handbag. She screamed so loudly that the whole house almost shook, and she nearly fainted right there. My mother had simply walked up and smacked the bug dead with her bare hand. Clara had stared at the squashed insect, trembling uncontrollably, before collapsing completely. It wasn't that I thought she was dumb or incapable, but honestly, someone like her didn't seem like they could plan something so cruel. Of course, whether the Shu family had been involved was a different story. After the Wang family started pressuring my father to remarry, he took me to meet Clara. I hadn't expected to see her in such a state. It was like a flower that had once been bright had suddenly dried up from not enough water. She looked thin and pale, like she had no life left in her, and everything about her seemed dull. Her once bright eyes were now cloudy and empty. But the moment she saw me, her gaze sharpened. If Richard hadn't stopped her, she would have run straight at me. I was startled, and Richard's face became serious. Then, out of nowhere, Clara dropped to her knees with a loud thud. "Wang! Mr. Wang!" She grabbed onto my father's pant leg, refusing to let go. Richard hadn't even had a chance to step back before Clara's face twisted, and she burst into tears. She sobbed. "Lily visits me every night. The moment I fall asleep, she's there. She keeps blaming me, saying I was the one who had her sold overseas. She's angry at me. She haunts me every night. For 3 months, I haven't had a single good night's sleep. I keep begging her, but nothing works. Finally, she agreed to leave me alone, but only if I promised to protect Ethan. She told me that Ethan and you are surrounded by dangerous people, and she's terrified. She said my family is the only one she knows with connections to the criminal world, and she warned me if I fail to keep Ethan safe, if he so much as loses a single hair, she'll come for me." Clara collapsed onto the floor, wailing. I promised, over and over again, and only then did she finally leave me alone. "Mr. Wang, I'm begging you, I can't take it anymore." I stared at Clara, completely speechless. Richard also watched her in silence. Then he asked, "So, this marriage plan, was it your idea?" Clara nodded immediately. "Yes, I threw a fit until my father agreed." Richard's next question was quiet but sharp. "Clara, do you love me?" Clara shook her head so violently it was almost funny. She waved her hands frantically, as if she were facing a scary monster. "I don't love you, Richard. I wouldn't dare. I swear I wouldn't dare." Richard ran his fingers over his prayer beads, then spoke calmly. "Marriage is impossible, but you may move into the Wang household as my fiancé to take care of Ethan." Clara's face lit up. Then Richard added, "For only 1 year." He didn't look at Clara when he said it. Instead, his gaze fell on me. Then he reached out and ruffled my hair, his voice steady. "Ethan, trust me. You only need to wait for 1 year." 6 months after my mother's death, rumors of Richard and Clara's engagement started to spread. That same night, Chloe Kim spent the entire evening at my mother's grave. Her family searched for her everywhere, worried sick. When they asked Richard, he went to the cemetery and found her. By then, she had collapsed from exhaustion, unconscious in his arms. When she woke up, her eyes were full of tears as she looked at Richard. "You know the Shu family is the most likely suspect," she whispered. "Yet you're still going to marry Clara Shu. Where's the honor you always talked about? Won't you regret this when you see Lily again in the afterlife?" Richard's gaze was indifferent. "The Shu family is powerful. It's a temporary thing." Chloe's voice trembled. "I told you, I can help you," Richard said. "Chloe, it's not just about getting power. I simply can't stand watching Clara continue living like a spoiled princess. I can't stand seeing her enjoy her luxurious life, untouched by any bad consequences. She wants to marry me so badly? Then I'll give her what she wants. Tell me, what could be more satisfying than keeping her by my side, day and night, making her suffer?" Chloe's tense expression gradually softened. So, this is revenge? She asked. Richard nodded. Yes. Richard. Chloe couldn't hold back anymore. She reached out and gently took his hand. You're truly suffering too much, she murmured. Having to pretend with someone as ridiculous as Clara, it's beneath you. For the first time, Richard didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he simply said, What choice do I have? Right now I am still under someone else's control. Chloe looked at him, and for the first time, the pain in her eyes was overwhelming. As the anniversary of my mother's death got closer, Richard finally took complete control of the Wang family, moving right into the center of the wealthy elite. With the Shu family supporting him, and the Shu family's deep connections to the criminal world, his actions could no longer be considered innocent. The people around him became more and more careful, not daring to make even a small mistake. Even I, as his son, sometimes felt a little scared when I looked at his face that showed no emotion. When a single sentence from him, said without any feeling, could decide whether people lived or died. The Richard who had once loved my mother so warmly, the gentle and peaceful man I had known, he was completely gone. A week before the anniversary of my mother's death, Richard's new company overseas was about to start. He decided to take Clara and me with him to Country F. The night before we left, he called Chloe. The show is about to begin, Isabel, he said. Would you like to come with us? On the other end of the line, Chloe laughed freely. Of course, Richard, she replied. I'll go with you. Sometime in the past 6 months, Chloe had become Isabel when he spoke to her. And in the business world, Chloe had put all her energy into his plans, helping him with ideas and strategies. Sometimes, when I sat alone, feeling confused, I wondered if I had to have a stepmother, my mother would probably have chosen Chloe. She seemed perfect, so perfect that you couldn't find a single flaw in her. Even Richard, over this past year, had slowly started to care for her, hadn't he? The day we arrived in Country F, it rained heavily. By the afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky with clouds that looked like they were on fire. Richard picked me up in his arms and stood there, looking out at the sky that seemed to be burning. I knew what he was thinking. He was thinking about my mother. I was too. I remembered the fire that night. I remembered the moment the flames took her. I remembered her last, painful scream. I tilted my head to look up at Richard. His eyes were red, so red that I couldn't tell if it was just the reflection of the fiery sky or something much deeper. On the third night, Richard told Chloe that there would be a banquet that evening. Chloe understood. She knew that tonight, everything would end. Stylists and makeup artists brought in racks and racks of beautiful gowns. In the end, Chloe chose a deep, red, floor-length mermaid gown with a long train. The banquet was going to be held on a luxury cruise ship. As Chloe stepped onto the ship, the heel of her stiletto got caught in the metal grating of the walkway and broke. A strange feeling of worry came over her. The ship was lit up with lights, but outside on the deck, men in black stood armed, bodyguards and mercenaries at every corner. For a very short moment, Chloe hesitated. She felt like she should turn back. Then Richard appeared. He was wearing a long black trench coat, and the suit underneath was also a dark shade of black. He was tall, elegant, and seemed effortlessly charming. He looked down at Chloe, his lips curving into a very slight smile that was hard to read. "Isabel," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "Come here." As if she were under a spell, Chloe lifted the bottom of her gown and took one step forward, then another, and another. Barefoot, she walked up the walkway, one step at a time, towards him. Chloe held out her hand to him, but Richard didn't take it. He had a cigarette burning between his fingers, and the smoke curled softly in the night air. "Go change your shoes," Richard said. "I'll finish this cigarette first." Chloe hesitated, but eventually turned and left. Richard leaned against the railing of the ship, looking out at the endless water. He smoked in complete silence, taking slow breaths. When only the end of the cigarette was left, he finally looked down. His eyes stopped on the wedding ring on his fourth finger. And then, softly, he whispered, "Lily." His fingers touched the ring, and for the first time in a long while, his face softened with tenderness. "Bless me," he murmured. "Let everything go smoothly." Many years later, I would still remember that night perfectly clearly. Richard hadn't kept me from seeing the violence. I was 6 years old, but my childhood had already ended long before that night. Chloe, now dressed elegantly, walked into the grand banquet hall. Her eyes scanned the room, and she hesitated. "Why? Are there so few people?" The moment she said those words, she froze. Because the people inside weren't important people from Country F. Almost every single one of them was someone she knew. Her eyes first saw Isabel, then my aunt, my grandfather. Her expression started to change. Her body tensed up, and she instinctively tried to move back, only to find that the way behind her was blocked by security. Then, with a deep, echoing thud, the massive, beautifully carved doors shut behind her. And they were locked. A visible shiver ran through Chloe. Her eyes darted around the room, searching frantically, until they finally stopped on a figure sitting in the shadows, dressed all in black. Richard. She let out a shaky breath, like she was holding onto a lifeline. "Richard!" But her voice was suddenly cut off, like someone whose throat had just been crushed. Because at that moment something was thrown out in front of her. A human body, bloody and so badly hurt you couldn't even recognize it. 2 tall mercenaries, their dark skin shining under the lights, had dragged him in and dumped him there like a bag of meat. The smell of blood was overpowering. The figure on the ground twitched, a horrible mess of flesh that barely looked like a person. Chloe let out a high-pitched scream. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. Richard's voice, as steady as ever, rang out. "Do you recognize him?" Chloe's breath caught. She squinted, trying to understand the mutilated body. Then she realized. It was Kenji Wang, the Wang family's oldest son, who was often sick and weak. The scream in Chloe's throat died instantly. She turned, her eyes wide with shock, to Richard. You! But Richard's face remained calm, showing no emotion, like the still surface of a deep lake. He didn't even look at Chloe. Instead, his gaze swept over the rest of the pale, trembling people in the hall. Then, in a strangely even tone, he said, "One by one, tell me everything you've done. If not—" His eyes flickered toward the broken, barely breathing body at Chloe's feet. "His fate will be yours." The words had barely been said before my aunt scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking so badly they could hardly hold her up. She blurted out, her voice trembling. "Brother-in-law, if I tell you everything, you won't kill me, right?" Richard didn't answer. He only turned the ring on his finger and said coolly, "You should already know whether what you've done deserves death or not." Panic filled her eyes. "Brother-in-law, I'll tell you everything, I swear. I was the one who convinced Father not to give Lily any money, to abandon her. I was the one who made it look like she stole from me, making Father beat her. When you two were dating, I was the one who reported it to the school, almost getting her kicked out. When Lily gave birth to Ethan, while she was still recovering, I tried to sneak into your room, but the maid caught me before I could do anything. When she died, I wanted to marry you, pretending to take care of Ethan. But I swear I had nothing to do with her death. You know this, right? My father and I, we didn't have the power to reach Country F." Richard gave a slow nod. That's true. He knew that Lily's death had nothing to do with Sarah. He also knew that despite all of Sarah's petty, disgusting schemes, they weren't enough to deserve death. But he could no longer control himself. His jaw clenched as he spat out. "You may not deserve to die, but that tongue of yours is truly revolting." "Brother-in-law?" Richard shut his eyes. Sarah screamed, "Ethan, please save your aunt!" As she was dragged away, her eyes locked onto mine, filled with utter despair. I closed my eyes too. Then silence. I thought to myself, at least she would never be able to talk badly about people again. Isabel's face was as white as a sheet of paper. But still, she gritted her teeth and stood up. She said, "After you and Lily started dating, she introduced you to me. The moment I saw you, I fell for you, but you never even looked at me properly. I was obsessed with breaking you and Lily up. I thought that if you separated, I'd have a chance. So I kept telling Lily that you were too poor, that you were just an orphan who had been trafficked, that you weren't good enough for her, but she never listened. Instead, she felt even more sorry for you. She treated you even better. Then the Wang family found you and brought you back. Your whole life changed overnight. And I was the one who kept scaring Lily. I told her that now that you were rich, there were plenty of beautiful women who would chase after you, that you would definitely leave her soon. At first, she didn't believe me, but I kept saying it, showing her examples, until she was foolish enough to believe it. But still, you didn't break up. Instead, you were about to get married. I was so jealous I was going crazy, but I never wanted Lily to die. I just couldn't understand. Lily and I were just ordinary, plain girls. So why was she so lucky? Why did she get to marry a man like you? Why did she get to be loved like that? I stopped dreaming about being with you. I just wanted her to be separated from you. I just wanted her to become ordinary again, just like me. It was her. It was Chloe. Suddenly, Isabel turned, pointing directly at Chloe. She tricked me. She told me she had a way to make Lily leave you. I believed her. I was stupid enough to believe her. Tears streamed down Isabel's face as she broke into gut-wrenching sobs. But I never in my worst nightmares thought she would have Lily killed. If I had known, I would rather die than do this. I stared at Isabel, watching her sobbing like a little kid who had broken their toy. But in my heart, all I thought was, so my first instincts had been right after all. I had never liked her. But my mother always spoke kindly of her, always remembered how Isabel had once bought her breakfast for a whole semester. She used to say, "Isabel might have a sharp tongue, but she has a kind heart. Back then I had no money for food, I nearly starved. It was Isabel who helped me through it." But my mother didn't know. People change. People always change. Isabel was dragged away. My grandfather, watching it all, was so terrified that he lost control of himself. He had been a middle-aged man who cheated on his wife and abandoned his daughter. He wasn't exactly the worst person ever, just a small man who had a little money and did whatever he wanted for pleasure. My grandmother had died because of him. My mother suffered a lot when she was young because of him. And yet the moment her body was cold, he had eagerly pushed his younger daughter, who he loved, forward, wanting her to become my stepmother. I hated him. But now, looking at his trembling old body, his hair all gray, his face twisted in fear, I felt something I couldn't name. A deep, wordless sadness. A hollow feeling of loss. If my mother were still alive, she, so kind and gentle, probably wouldn't have even hated him. The hall grew emptier and emptier. Eventually, the only people left were strangers to me. It was my father who told me that every single one of them had once made my mother suffer. By the end, only Chloe remained. She was deathly pale, standing frozen in terror, and beside her were 6 skulls, specially treated and preserved. The 6 people who had murdered my mother. Chloe's voice was hoarse as she asked, "Richard, when did you know?" Richard lowered his gaze, brushing his thumb over the ring on his 4th finger. He said, "The moment you suggested that I marry you. That day in the hospital." Chloe's breath caught. "Why?" Richard slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. His gaze was dark, so dark that it felt like a dried-up well, one that had been empty and abandoned for a long time, completely lifeless. He said, "Because after you spoke, I suddenly remembered something Lily once told me." Chloe swallowed, her throat dry. "What did she say?" Richard's expression softened slightly, as though he had been pulled into a distant memory. He spoke quietly. "When Lily gave birth to Ethan, she lost a lot of blood. She was weak, barely holding on. When she woke up, she looked at Ethan and whispered to me, 'Richard, you know, before I lost consciousness, I kept thinking, if I were to die, the only person I'd trust to take care of you and Ethan is Isabel.'" His voice was calm, measured. "You remember, don't you, Isabel? You walked in just as she said that?" Chloe's face turned an unnatural shade of white. "That's it?" she asked. "That's what made you think I was guilty? You blamed everything on me just because of that?" She let out a sharp, unsteady laugh, her voice shaking. "Richard, where's your proof? Do you have evidence? Do you have any real proof that I was the one who planned all of this?" Richard let out a low chuckle. "You're very smart, Isabel. You covered your tracks well, made sure to keep yourself clean. You led me to suspect Clara first because the Shu family has ties to the criminal world, because they have businesses in multiple countries. It made them the most obvious suspects. And in the beginning, I did suspect her. After all, Clara did once tell Lily she'd have her sold overseas. But I quickly realized that Clara wasn't the mastermind." Chloe clenched her fists. "How? How can you be so sure? With the Shu family's power, they could have erased every trace of their involvement." Richard's voice remained steady. "If the Shu family had truly done it, they wouldn't have still insisted on marrying their daughter into my family. Isabel, do you really think Clara's father, an experienced, shrewd man who has weathered countless storms, would ever push his own daughter into the arms of a man whose wife his family had murdered?" His footsteps were slow as he approached her. When he reached her, he raised his foot and pressed it down on Chloe's trembling fingers. "You thought leaving yourself 2 scapegoats would be enough to keep you safe. You thought Kenji and Clara would take the blame for you, shielding you forever?" His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the air suffocating. "The moment I saw you sneaking out of Kenji's house in disguise that night, I already knew what had happened. Kenji adored you, worshipped you. But he also knew he could never truly have you, never give you the life you wanted. So he let himself be used by you, willingly becoming your puppet. He spent his last breath trying to protect you, taking all the blame onto himself. But Isabel, you are cold, ruthless, poisonous. You never deserved that kind of loyalty. You destroyed him." Richard lifted his foot and kicked Chloe's shoulder, sending her crashing backward. His voice turned ice cold. "Every bit of suffering Lily endured, I will return to you 100-fold, 1,000-fold." He flicked his hand, and immediately several men stepped forward, binding Chloe's arms and legs tightly. Chloe thrashed violently. "Punish the ones responsible, not me! Lily was a fool. Isabel lured her out. Kenji paid the money, and those 6 carried it out. They're dead, Richard. You killed every last one of them." She glared at him, spitting venom. "I had nothing to do with it. How was I supposed to know Kenji had feelings for me? How was I supposed to know he would commit such a crime just to please me? And don't forget, without me, you'd never be where you are today. The Kim family invested in you. I invested in you. If you lay a finger on me, you'll ruin everything you've built." Richard let out a quiet laugh. "You're right. My success today was partly built on your and the Kim family's support. But tell me, Isabel, do you really think I, Richard Wang, care about success?" Chloe's eyes widened in horror. "You're insane!" she shrieked. "Lily is dead. The entire Wang family belongs to you now. Soon, even half of the Kim family will be yours. You have the power to rule everything, to control everything. And you're going to throw it all away for a corpse? Is it worth it?" Richard's voice was calm, unwavering. "For a woman like you? Of course not. But for Lily?" His lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "For Lily, I would walk through fire and knives, die 1,000 deaths, and I would still do it willingly." That night on the deep-sea cruise ship, Chloe's screams echoed for most of the night. It's said that each of her 10 fingers was cut off one by one. Her bones were broken inch by inch. Someone used a very small, sharp knife to slice the flesh off her body piece by piece. Her eyes were the last to be gouged out, so she could watch her body being horribly disfigured. In the end, she was burned alive in a raging fire. Her charred body was thrown into the open sea. After all this, Richard left the mess and took me back to the country. As for how much effort the Shu family had to put into cleaning everything up, that wasn't our concern. Before we came, my father had made a deal with the Shu family. As long as they handled the aftermath cleanly, he would make peace with them once and for all. Chloe, who had gone abroad, mysteriously disappeared. At the same time, Kenji, the oldest son of the Wang family, also vanished under strange circumstances. Richard and the Shu family searched abroad for 3 months. In the end, a sea rescue team found debris containing Chloe's DNA. They also found a severed arm from which Kenji's DNA was taken. A foreign sailor claimed that he had once seen the two secretly meeting on the deck in the middle of the night. Later, an argument broke out. Kenji even hit Chloe. The sailor had wanted to step in, but someone pulled him away. Beyond that, he wasn't sure what happened. In short, the deaths of these two seemed to be nothing more than a tragic accident from a lover's quarrel. When the news spread back home, everyone in our circle was shocked. No one had imagined that Chloe and Kenji were having an affair, nor that Chloe, while so close to Richard, was secretly involved with Kenji. Greedy for both, she ended up with nothing, completely erased from existence. A sad end. The Kim family didn't believe Chloe's death was an accident, but with no proof, they had no choice but to accept it. From then on, the Kim family started having a long run of bad luck. Within just 5 years, they, once a big name in wealthy circles, disappeared without a trace. Rumor said that the younger people in the Kim family were completely useless. It was only a matter of time before their remaining money was all gone. I heard that Clara had fully recovered from her illness. She never dreamed of my mother again. My father divorced her. She happily went back to the Shu family. Over the past year, maybe because she had promised my mother's spirit to take good care of me, she had really tried. Because of that, she seemed to have started to genuinely care for me. Every few days, she would come back to see me, but only when my father wasn't home. If they happened to see each other, she would run away faster than a rabbit. On the first anniversary of my mother's death, I noticed my father's left hand was wrapped in thick bandages. Later, when the bandages were removed, his ring finger was missing. The wound was so clean it couldn't have been an accident. He took me to my mother's grave once. There were signs that someone had been digging there. I immediately understood. My father must have buried the only remaining finger that had belonged to both him and my mother. When I turned 18, Richard already had a full head of white hair. Over the years, he worked himself incredibly hard. He never let anyone help him. He personally took care of everything while also looking after me. I looked like my father, but my eyes, they looked more and more like my mother's. He often stared into them, looking lost in thought. Sometimes he would whisper a name, Lily. But she had been gone for 13 years. At first, people told him he should get married again, but as time passed, no one ever mentioned it anymore. The year we returned from Country F, we weren't alone. A girl, 2 years younger than me, came with us. My father named her Chloe. She was an orphan, but her background was clear, with no complicated connections. My father had carefully chosen her from almost 100 children to stay by my side, to be my companion. After we came back, I slowly started talking again, especially when I was with Chloe. Because deep down, I always felt that we were alike. Only people who have the same kind of pain can find comfort in each other's company. I didn't have a mother, but I still had a father who loved me more than anything. But when she was 3, both of her parents had died. We loved lying on the rooftop, whispering to each other, sharing a pain that only we could understand. We couldn't tell anyone else, but we could tell each other. In the blink of an eye, over 10 years passed. I turned 20, Chloe was 18. My father had raised her well, so well, I liked her very much. When I graduated from university at 22, I slowly started taking over the company's business. Later, when Chloe finished school and could help me, Richard finally let go. Then, as I handled several difficult business matters on my own, my father completely handed everything over to me. In my free time, I studied antique restoration. Oh, I almost forgot, back then, both my mother and Chloe had studied this, but my mother was always a little bit better at it. Their teacher once said, "Lily's heart is calmer, her hands steadier. Chloe is always just a little behind. She should watch Lily more and learn from her." Maybe this was one of the reasons Chloe had my mother's fingers cut off, one by one. When I put Chloe in charge of the company's money, Clara came running to me many times. She even tried to convince me with real concern. "Ethan, how can you let a woman handle your money? What if you ever need to go to court and can't get your own funds? Chloe is just your father's adopted daughter. Even if she were your real sister, don't families still fight to the death over what they'll inherit? You mustn't be careless. Your father and mother only had one son, you. You can't just let the Wang family's fortune fall into someone else's hands." Clara and I have a good relationship now. Hearing her say this, I acted spoiled and teased her. "But Clara, you're still here. If Chloe ever has any bad intentions, you can sell her off to another country too." At that, Clara frowned even more, sighing. "I was born a pampered young lady who never had to lift a finger. I never planned to take over any family business, never wanted to worry about anything. I was just going to spend money carelessly my whole life. So why is it that now, in middle age, my worries are heavier than ever?" Her exaggerated frustration made me laugh. I joked, "Clara, don't you think being a powerful, unstoppable villainess sounds pretty cool?" She seriously thought about it, as if she was a little tempted. Then she reached out and stroked my hair for a long time. Suddenly, her eyes turned red. She was about to cry again. I gently hugged her. I understood. So many years had passed. Fewer and fewer people still remembered my mother. Even my aunt had stopped secretly cursing her under her breath. My grandfather, after having a stroke, had been dead for years. He spent his last 2 years in bed. With no one to care for him, he developed terrible bed sores and suffered a lot. They say in the end, he only wished for death to free him. And then there was Isabel. She later married a man who was disabled. Her life wasn't easy. When he was in a bad mood, he drank. And when he drank, he hit her and cursed her. But she kept having children, one after another. Divorce was never an option. The dead will never return. The living continue to struggle. But it's okay. I have my father. I have Clara. And there are even strangers I don't know. People who still remember my mother. Her grave is never without fresh flowers. Her teacher visits often. The man she loved most misses her with every second that passes. And her beloved son. I will fulfill the dreams she never had the chance to complete. And then there's Clara. My mother probably never expected that in the end. The one person who would always remember her, always think of her, would be Clara. The one who would protect me in her place. A year after I graduated, my father arranged a wedding for me and Chloe. When we knelt before him to show our respect, he smiled so gently, so deeply, yet there was a quiet feeling of letting go in his expression. At that moment, a bad feeling gripped my heart. After the wedding, I didn't want to leave his side, staying close to him all the time. But on the anniversary of my mother's death, he still left. Maybe he was afraid of my sadness, afraid that his own heart would become soft, and he would change his mind. So he didn't let me be there for his last moments. He only left me a letter. The letter said, "Ethan, forgive me. Your mother is too lonely on her own. I must go be with her. When I die, cremate me, burn me to ashes, and take me to the place where your mother died. Scatter my ashes there. I'm going to find her. I'm going to find my Lily. Ethan, your father is happy. Right now I am happier than I have been in the past 18 years. So let me go, will you, Ethan? Will you send me off yourself?" Holding the letter, I fell to the ground, crying uncontrollably. Chloe didn't say a word. She simply stayed beside me, quietly, just like she always had. She was my shadow, my constant friend, my safe place. She was the one who made me feel at peace. I took my father's ashes to the place where my mother had died. The landfill didn't look the same anymore, no longer dirty, no longer chaotic. Still, I found my way back to where it had all happened. With trembling hands, I scattered his ashes, letting them drift into the wind. Chloe held my hand the entire time, never letting go. That night, I had a beautiful dream. In my dream, my father was young and handsome again, his hair still jet black. My mother was radiant, gentle and warm, her smile as sweet as ever. They were holding my hands as I stumbled forward, just learning to walk. I tripped and fell, then ran towards them again. My father lifted me high, putting me on his shoulders. My mother was laughing. She kept laughing. And when my father looked at her, his eyes were filled with nothing but love. In my dream, I must have been crying, because when I woke up, my pillow was soaked. Beside me, Chloe whispered softly, "Ethan, I will stay with you. Forever." In the 3rd year of our marriage, Chloe became pregnant. When it was time for her to give birth, Clara arrived at the hospital with almost 100 bodyguards, surrounding the building inside and out. She had truly become a strong, fearless leader. Seeing it made Chloe feel completely safe. She gave birth easily to twins, a boy and a girl. We named them Georgios Wang and Sylvie Liu. It wasn't just my decision. Chloe and I chose the names together. Each child had one of our last names. Chloe said, "I was once an orphan, without a name or roots. I only wish for my parents to rest in peace wherever they are." When the twins turned 1 month old, Chloe and I took them to the cemetery. At my parents' graves, roses were blooming beautifully. The wind carried their fragrance, filling the air with a gentle, lovely scent. Among the bright flowers, I thought I saw my parents, Richard and Lily, young and full of life once more. They say that kind people will be reborn into good families, destined for a life of warmth and happiness. My parents must have already been reborn into such a place. Somewhere, they are being cherished, held close, loved deeply. And if I have a next life, I would still want to be their son. If there truly is a next life, then in that lifetime, the 3 of us will never be apart again.